The narcissist, life constriction, and emotional hypersensitization. Part 1. Most people imagine psychological manipulation as something that happens during arguments, moments of conflict, or obvious acts of control. They picture insults, criticism, deception, or intimidation. While these behaviors certainly exist, they may not represent the deepest transformation that occurs within an unhealthy relationship. A more profound question begins to emerge when we examine the gradual narrowing of another person's life. What if manipulation is not only about influencing emotions? What if it is about influencing the entire environment in which those emotions exist? What happens when a person's world becomes progressively smaller until nearly every meaningful emotional experience originates from one relationship? Psychologists have long recognized that human beings do not develop in isolation. Our emotional health depends upon a diverse network of experiences, relationships, interests, routines, and environments. Family, friendships, meaningful work, hobbies, recreation, learning, and community all contribute to psychological stability. Each provides opportunities for emotional regulation, personal growth, and perspective. Together they form a balanced psychological ecosystem. When one area becomes stressful, the others often help restore equilibrium. This diversity protects the individual from becoming emotionally dependent upon any single source of meaning or validation. Life constriction describes the gradual reduction of that psychological ecosystem. Although the term itself is descriptive rather than a formal clinical diagnosis, the process reflects several well-established psychological principles. Over time, the individual's world becomes increasingly narrow. Activities once enjoyed begin disappearing, friendships become less frequent, family relationships become strained or neglected, personal goals lose their urgency, interests that once produced excitement slowly fade into the background. The person's attention becomes concentrated within an increasingly limited emotional environment. This narrowing rarely occurs overnight. More often it develops through countless small adjustments that appear insignificant when viewed individually. A social invitation is declined because it might create conflict. A hobby is postponed because maintaining peace within the relationship feels more important. Contact with friends becomes less frequent because it repeatedly produces arguments or subtle criticism. Family visits become emotionally exhausting. Career ambitions are quietly placed aside because emotional survival consumes more attention than personal growth. Each individual decision appears understandable. Collectively, they reshape an entire life. Behavioral psychology provides one way of understanding this gradual process. Human behavior is constantly shaped by consequences. Behaviors associated with comfort, safety, or relief become more likely to occur in the future. Behaviors associated with stress, uncertainty, or emotional pain gradually decrease. This principle does not require conscious awareness. It reflects the nervous system's natural tendency to move toward experiences perceived as safer while avoiding those repeatedly associated with discomfort. Imagine someone who enjoys spending time with close friends. Each social gathering once provided laughter, perspective, and emotional renewal. Suppose that after every gathering, however, conflict begins waiting at home. Questions become accusations. Ordinary conversations become interrogations. The evening ends in criticism or emotional withdrawal. After enough repetitions, something predictable begins happening. The individual no longer associates friends only with enjoyment. The nervous system also begins associating those experiences with the conflict that follows. Avoidance slowly becomes easier than enduring the emotional consequences. The same process can occur across many areas of life. Professional opportunities become sources of anxiety because success produces jealousy or resentment. Family gatherings become emotionally costly because they trigger arguments. Personal accomplishments become strangely uncomfortable because they invite criticism instead of celebration. The nervous system gradually learns that many ordinary experiences carry hidden emotional risks. Rather than expanding into the world, the individual begins withdrawing from it. This process is particularly significant because human attention is limited. As life becomes smaller, Whatever remains naturally occupies a greater percentage of psychological space. If friendships disappear, conversations within the relationship become more important. If hobbies vanish, emotional energy has fewer destinations. If family connections weaken, the relationship begins supplying an even larger share of belonging, identity, and daily interaction. The shrinking world does not merely remove experiences, it magnifies those that remain. This is where life constriction begins interacting with emotional hypersensitization. In the previous essay, we explored how repeated unpredictability can gradually lower the nervous system's threshold for emotional reaction. Here we encounter the next stage of that process. A narrower life means fewer competing experiences capable of moderating emotional responses. Instead of receiving reassurance from multiple relationships and environments, the individual increasingly depends upon one emotional system. Every change within that system, therefore, carries greater psychological weight. The relationship slowly becomes the emotional climate in which everything else is interpreted. A disagreement no longer affects only one evening. It influences work the next morning. It follows the individual into social interactions. It shapes concentration, motivation, sleep, and emotional energy. Because fewer alternative experiences exist to restore balance, the emotional impact becomes amplified. What once represented one difficult moment now colors an entire day or even an entire week. Psychologist Kurt Lewin argued that behavior cannot be understood apart from the environment in which it occurs. His famous observation that behavior is a function of both the person and the environment reminds us that psychological experiences are never isolated from context. When the environment itself becomes progressively restricted, behavior naturally changes along with it. The individual is not simply responding differently because their personality has changed. They are responding within an emotional landscape that has become dramatically smaller and more concentrated. This concentration creates an important illusion. As the relationship occupies more psychological territory, it begins feeling more significant than it objectively is. Every disagreement appears larger because there are fewer experiences competing for attention. Every emotional shift seems more important because fewer alternative sources of stability remain. The relationship gradually becomes the primary lens through which reality is evaluated. One consequence often surprises those experiencing it. They begin believing they have simply lost interest in the outside world. Activities that once felt meaningful now seem strangely empty. Friends appear less interesting. Personal ambitions lose emotional intensity. Even moments of freedom may feel uncomfortable because the nervous system has become accustomed to organizing itself around the relationship. What feels like a change in personality may instead reflect a change in psychological environment. This narrowing of life also creates conditions in which emotional conditioning becomes increasingly efficient. A scientist attempting to study a single variable often removes competing influences from the experiment. Something remarkably similar may occur psychologically when competing sources of meaning gradually disappear. The relationship becomes the dominant emotional variable. Praise carries greater impact because there are fewer alternative sources of affirmation. Criticism cuts more deeply because there are fewer relationships capable of restoring confidence. Approval feels more valuable because it has become increasingly scarce elsewhere. Whether this process develops through deliberate manipulation, repeated interpersonal conflict, or the cumulative effects of emotional instability, the result can appear remarkably similar. The person's world becomes progressively smaller while the relationship becomes progressively larger. One process reinforces the other until emotional dependence begins emerging not simply from affection, but from the structure of everyday life itself. This raises another important question. If life constriction increases the psychological importance of the relationship, what happens to the nervous system when that increasingly important relationship remains unpredictable? Why does a shrinking world often produce even greater emotional sensitivity instead of greater emotional stability? To answer that question, we must examine how life constriction and emotional hypersensitization begin reinforcing one another, creating a psychological cycle in which each process strengthens the next. Part 2. When a smaller world creates greater sensitivity. If life constriction increases the psychological importance of the relationship, another question immediately follows. Why does the relationship often become even more emotionally overwhelming instead of more emotionally secure? Intuition might suggest that concentrating attention on one important relationship would strengthen feelings of stability and closeness. Yet in many psychologically unhealthy relationships, the opposite appears to occur. The smaller the person's world becomes, the greater their emotional sensitivity often becomes. To understand why, we must examine the relationship between emotional dependence, attention, and the nervous system itself. Human attention is one of the mind's most valuable resources. At any given moment, only a limited amount of emotional energy can be devoted to interpreting the surrounding world. In a psychologically balanced life, that attention is naturally distributed across many different experiences. Work demands concentration. Friends provide perspective. Family offers connection. Personal interests generate curiosity. Recreation creates recovery. Learning introduces novelty. These experiences continuously interrupt one another, preventing any single emotional event from dominating the entire psychological landscape. Life constriction gradually removes those interruptions. As competing experiences disappear, the relationship begins receiving an increasingly disproportionate share of emotional attention. Every conversation becomes more significant because fewer conversations exist elsewhere. Every disagreement occupies more mental space because fewer meaningful experiences compete with it. Every moment of affection becomes more valuable because fewer sources of emotional nourishment remain available. The relationship slowly expands until it becomes the central organizing principle of everyday life. Psychologists have long understood that attention amplifies experience. The more intensely we monitor something, the larger it appears within consciousness. Pain provides a useful example. Individuals who continually monitor physical discomfort often experience that discomfort as more intrusive than individuals whose attention remains divided among many activities. The pain itself may not have changed dramatically, but the amount of awareness devoted to it has increased. Emotional experiences often follow a remarkably similar pattern. Within a constricted life, emotional monitoring becomes nearly continuous. The individual begins checking facial expressions, voice inflections, body language, and subtle shifts in mood with increasing frequency. Silence acquires meaning. Delayed responses become emotionally significant. Ordinary fluctuations within the relationship are examined repeatedly in an attempt to predict what may happen next. The nervous system becomes occupied not simply with participating in the relationship, but with constantly evaluating it. This continuous monitoring strengthens the very hypersensitization discussed in the previous essay. The nervous system learns that every small emotional signal deserves careful attention because those signals may predict future conflict. What once required obvious criticism now requires only a subtle change in tone. What once required an argument now requires only a brief moment of emotional distance. The threshold for emotional activation continues falling because the mind has become increasingly skilled at detecting potential danger. This creates a paradox. The individual believes they are paying closer attention in order to feel safer. In reality, the constant monitoring often produces the opposite effect. The more intensely the nervous system searches for signs of instability, the more instability it begins discovering. Ambiguous situations are interpreted cautiously. Neutral events become emotionally charged. Ordinary uncertainty starts feeling like evidence that something is wrong. The search for certainty gradually produces greater uncertainty. Cognitive psychology offers an important insight into this process. Human beings naturally develop attentional biases. Once the brain identifies something as important, it begins noticing related information more frequently. A person shopping for a particular automobile suddenly sees that model everywhere. Someone expecting criticism becomes unusually aware of disapproving facial expressions. This does not necessarily mean criticism has increased. It means attention has become selectively organized around detecting it. Within a psychologically constricted environment, this attentional bias may become remarkably powerful. Because the relationship now occupies such a large portion of daily life, nearly every emotionally significant event passes through the same psychological filter. There are fewer opportunities for the nervous system to encounter experiences that challenge its growing expectations. Instead, each new interaction reinforces lessons learned from previous interactions. The absence of corrective experiences becomes especially important. Healthy relationships rarely exist in complete isolation. Friends often provide reassurance after conflict. Family members offer alternative perspectives. Personal achievements restore confidence following disappointment. Recreation reminds the individual that life contains joy beyond immediate emotional struggles. These experiences help regulate emotional intensity by placing difficult moments within a broader context. Life constriction steadily removes those protective influences. Without alternative perspectives, doubts become more convincing. Without meaningful distractions, emotional rumination becomes more persistent. Without independent accomplishments, self-worth becomes increasingly dependent upon the relationship. The emotional system gradually loses its ability to self-regulate because so many external sources of balance have disappeared. This narrowing also affects memory. Human memory is strongly influenced by repetition. Experiences repeated frequently become more accessible than experiences encountered only occasionally. As life constriction continues, the emotional experiences associated with the relationship begin dominating autobiographical memory itself. The individual starts recalling arguments more quickly than achievements. They remember criticism more easily than moments of personal growth. Their psychological narrative slowly reorganizes around the relationship because the relationship has become the primary source of emotionally significant experiences. Over time, this creates what psychologists sometimes describe as cognitive narrowing. Attention becomes focused upon immediate emotional concerns, while broader life goals gradually fade into the background. Long-term planning becomes difficult because emotional survival consumes so much psychological energy. Creativity declines because uncertainty absorbs attention that might otherwise support exploration and imagination. Curiosity gives way to vigilance. Growth gives way to maintenance. One of the most revealing signs of life constriction is not simply that a person's world becomes smaller. It is that they begin forgetting there was once a larger world. The reduction happens so gradually that yesterday's limitations become today's normal. Opportunities that once felt essential now seem unnecessary. Friendships that once provided strength begin feeling optional. Dreams that once inspired action quietly disappear from everyday thought. The nervous system adapts so completely to the smaller environment that the individual often mistakes adaptation for preference. This is why emotional dependence frequently develops without conscious intention. Few people decide that they want one relationship to become the center of their psychological universe. Rather, countless small adaptations slowly remove alternative sources of meaning until emotional investment becomes concentrated almost entirely within a single interpersonal system. The relationship no longer occupies the largest place in life simply because it is loved. It occupies the largest place because so much else has gradually been displaced. As emotional dependence grows, hypersensitization accelerates. Greater dependence makes emotional signals more important. Greater importance increases vigilance. Increased vigilance lowers the threshold for emotional reaction. Heightened emotional reactions make the relationship feel even more significant. The cycle begins reinforcing itself with remarkable efficiency. This self-reinforcing process helps explain why leaving the relationship often feels psychologically impossible even when the individual recognizes it has become unhealthy. The obstacle is not merely emotional attachment, it is structural dependence. The relationship has gradually replaced so many other psychological supports that imagining life without it feels less like ending a relationship and more like losing an entire world. This brings us to the final stage of the process. What happens after life constriction and emotional hypersensitization have reinforced one another for months or even years? How does this cycle reshape identity itself, and why does recovery require far more than simply walking away? To answer those questions, we must examine how a shrinking world eventually becomes a shrinking sense of self, and how that cycle can finally be broken. Part 3. When the world becomes the self. By the time life constriction and emotional hypersensitization have reinforced one another for months or years, the consequences extend far beyond the relationship itself. What began as a series of adaptations gradually becomes a new way of experiencing reality. The individual is no longer responding only to another person's behavior. They are responding from within an emotional world that has become increasingly narrow, increasingly uncertain, and increasingly organized around the anticipation of distress. The relationship has not simply occupied more time. It has occupied more psychological space until it begins shaping the person's sense of identity. Identity is not formed in isolation. Psychologists have long understood that our sense of self develops through repeated interactions with the world around us. We discover who we are through work, friendships, creativity, learning, family, personal values, and meaningful challenges. Each experience contributes another piece to the larger picture. A healthy identity is rarely supported by one relationship alone. It is distributed across many different areas of life, allowing the individual to experience disappointment in one area without losing their entire psychological foundation. Life constriction slowly changes that balance. As friendships disappear, hobbies fade, ambitions are postponed, and meaningful routines are abandoned, the relationship begins carrying more psychological weight than it was ever meant to support. Eventually, the individual no longer asks whether they are happy with their life. They ask whether the relationship feels stable. They no longer measure themselves by their personal growth, their accomplishments, or the quality of their character. They begin measuring themselves by the emotional condition of one relationship. Their identity becomes organized around maintaining psychological equilibrium within an increasingly unstable environment. This shift often happens so gradually that it escapes conscious awareness. The individual may believe they are simply trying harder, becoming more understanding, or making necessary sacrifices for someone they love. Yet every adaptation quietly reorganizes the structure of everyday life. Time once devoted to personal interests becomes devoted to conflict resolution. Emotional energy once invested in growth becomes invested in damage control. Attention once directed toward the future becomes consumed by managing the present. The world continues shrinking while the relationship continues expanding. The consequences reach into nearly every aspect of psychological functioning. Decision-making becomes increasingly cautious because every choice is evaluated according to its possible effect on the relationship. Personal goals begin feeling unrealistic because emotional survival requires constant attention. Confidence gradually weakens because opportunities to experience competence outside the relationship become increasingly rare. The individual begins living reactively rather than intentionally. Instead of moving toward a meaningful future, they devote their energy to preventing the next emotional disruption. The nervous system adapts to this reality with remarkable efficiency. Experiences unrelated to the relationship gradually lose emotional intensity because they occur less frequently. Experiences within the relationship become increasingly significant because they dominate daily life. The brain naturally assigns greater importance to what is encountered most often. Over time, the emotional landscape becomes heavily concentrated around one source of uncertainty. Everything else begins fading into the background. This helps explain why many individuals describe feeling as though they have lost themselves. They are not merely grieving the relationship, they are grieving the disappearance of the larger life that once surrounded it. The person they remember being existed within a world filled with friendships, ambitions, interests, routines, and possibilities. That world has slowly contracted until it feels unfamiliar or even unreachable. The loss extends beyond another person. It includes the gradual erosion of countless experiences that once gave life variety and meaning. An important misunderstanding often follows. Because the individual now feels anxious, emotionally reactive, and uncertain, they conclude these qualities define their personality. They begin saying that they have always been overly sensitive or emotionally difficult. Yet those who knew them years earlier often remember someone very different. They remember curiosity instead of vigilance, confidence instead of hesitation, playfulness instead of constant emotional monitoring. What changed was not necessarily the person's essential character. What changed was the environment in which that character had been forced to operate. This distinction is psychologically significant. Adaptation should not be confused with identity. The human nervous system is designed to learn from repeated experience. Under prolonged uncertainty, it becomes more vigilant. Under repeated criticism, it becomes more cautious. Under emotional instability, it becomes increasingly sensitive to signs of future instability. These responses reflect learning rather than permanent transformation. They are evidence of flexibility, even when that flexibility develops in painful ways. Recovery, therefore, requires more than physical distance from the relationship. Leaving removes one source of conditioning, but it does not automatically restore the larger psychological world that has gradually disappeared. Recovery involves rebuilding the diversity that life constrictions slowly removed. Relationships must be renewed, interests rediscovered, skills developed, curiosity encouraged. Meaningful routines re-established. The nervous system requires repeated experiences of safety, competence, and emotional consistency before it begins expecting those experiences again. This process is often slower than people anticipate. Many become discouraged because they expect immediate relief once the relationship ends. They interpret lingering anxiety as evidence that they have failed to recover. Psychology suggests another explanation. The nervous system continues operating according to the rules it learned during prolonged exposure to uncertainty. Just as emotional conditioning developed through repetition, emotional recovery develops through repetition. Safety becomes believable only after it has been experienced consistently enough to replace older expectations. One of the most powerful steps in this process is the expansion of life itself. Every meaningful friendship restored weakens the monopoly once held by the relationship. Every personal achievement creates another source of confidence. Every new interest broadens the psychological landscape. Every healthy routine reminds the nervous system that life contains far more than emotional survival. As the world expands, the relationship naturally occupies a smaller percentage of psychological space. Emotional balance begins returning not because the past has been erased, but because the present has become richer. This gradual expansion also interrupts hypersensitization. A nervous system surrounded by diverse, predictable, and emotionally healthy experiences has less reason to remain in a constant state of vigilance. Attention becomes distributed across many areas of life instead of remaining fixed upon one source of uncertainty. Emotional signals lose some of their overwhelming intensity because they are no longer the only experiences competing for awareness. Perspective quietly returns. Perhaps the deepest lesson is that life constriction and emotional hypersensitization are mutually reinforcing processes. A smaller world increases emotional dependence. Greater dependence increases vigilance. Increased vigilance strengthens emotional sensitivity. Heightened sensitivity encourages further withdrawal from the outside world. The cycle continues until the individual begins mistaking adaptation for identity and survival for living. Understanding this cycle changes the way we interpret both the problem and the solution. The goal is not simply to become less sensitive, it is to become less psychologically confined. As life grows larger, emotional experiences naturally become more balanced because they exist within a richer and more diverse context. The relationship no longer serves as the sole measure of happiness, security, or self-worth. It becomes one part of a much larger human experience. The deepest consequence of life constriction is not that it limits where a person goes. It limits what becomes psychologically possible. It narrows attention, compresses identity, and concentrates emotional life until one relationship begins carrying the weight of an entire existence. The deepest form of recovery is therefore not merely escape from an unhealthy relationship. It is the gradual reconstruction of a world large enough that no single relationship can ever again become the center of everything. When life expands, perspective expands with it. As perspective returns, the nervous system slowly releases the expectation that every moment must be monitored for danger. The individual begins discovering that they are not returning to the person they once were. They are building a life in which they are finally free to become that person again.